Future is a book that we commissioned a couple of years ago. We approached 18 economists plus the humorist P.J. O'Rourke, and we asked them, take a look in your crystal ball 50 years out, and what do you see as the trends coming in the future? And is it prosperity? Is it peril? And importantly, what could we do today to make sure that there is a future of prosperity versus peril? What pitfalls are there, and what we would need to do to avoid them? What potential opportunities are there that we should be doing things now to make sure they realize their potential, right? So quickly, many of the things that they raised was seeing that there will likely continue to be improvements in healthcare and education, transportation, energy, the workplace, and so on. But those improvements will only happen to the extent that we can avoid having the kind of misguided government policies that will skew them away from being able to exploit the wonderful opportunities. Another important trend, of course, is the Uberization of the economy as we shift to what's known as the sharing economy, perhaps away from a structured workplace into a workplace where we're all connected together individually in dynamic ways that could just be revolutionary in a good way. Another thing, of course, is the Internet of Everything, and what are the implications of that. We'll touch on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and so on. We touched on the debt, the U.S. debt. Huge problem. What's going to happen with that? Or can we just keep ignoring it? Will it really go away? Do we really owe it to ourselves so we don't have to worry about it? And then very importantly, education, because we all know that education is the future of our world, and what can we do to take advantage of the new technologies? There are all these wonderful alternatives coming away, Khan Academy and alt school and online learning and other things, but then at the same time we have, this massive Common Core. Do we double down on Common Core? Do we do Common Core 3.0, et cetera? And which would be the way to go? So those are a lot of the things that it touches on. So we're going to start a little bit expanding on those themes. Then we'll get back to or tie in the presentations this morning and bring all of you in and your questions and so on. So I'm just going to start, since we missed Lawrence's Ask Alex, to share with us a little bit, since he's very involved in startups, technology, and so on, what you see occurring and what opportunities or perhaps pitfalls you see in the move to Uberization of the economy or the sharing economy.
I'd like to make that a little bit bigger. I think I'm seeing three trends that are affecting my job, which is finding startups and investing in them. There's certainly the sharing economy, which ranges from Uber at one end to Airbnb at the other. And really what that is it's technology-enabled platforms that let people use resources that were locked away before and just not economic to address. And I've seen startups where people, I don't know if it'll be successful, but they will let people rent out their closet for storage. So you can just imagine the gambit of types of innovations that you can let people unlock, even their closets. And another major thing that I'm seeing is that I think is really going to impact the economy, and it's still really in the early days, is what you say, what a lot of people think of as Bitcoin, but I think now is more defined as blockchain. And for the first time in human history, just like the internet enabled people to freely exchange information on a peer-to-peer level or on a one-to-many level without having to go through the hierarchy of media companies, now people can exchange value on a one-to-one level with very little friction.
Why is that important?
Well, for example, in my industry, a friend of mine is doing, in the next couple weeks, the first initial coin offering. And if you think of what it takes to invest in a venture capital fund, you have to be an accredited investor, you have to go through a lot of lawyers, you're locked up in a fund for up to 10 years before you can get your money out. If the venture fund is successful, maybe you get your money, maybe you get 2-3 times your money back. But there's a lot of steps. A company might have to go public to repay your investors. There's a lot of steps. And for the first time, which I think will be very disruptive, using blockchain and Bitcoin-like technology, there's a fund that's using that to basically let people buy coins or tokens of value in their fund. And as companies in that fund, if a venture capital fund maybe will have 10 or 20 companies in it, they can look to see what the value of each of those companies is and potentially trade that value to other people. And the only reason you're able to do that is because of blockchain technology, which lets two complete strangers be certain that their exchange of value is actually happening. Now, who knows, it might be a total failure, but that's the type of thing that's very disruptive and really changing the economics of how to run a venture capital fund, from letting more people in to letting people get out easier with less friction. And finally, I think the third area, which I think we can all talk about because it has to do with the future of work, is artificial intelligence. Basically, I think there was a time where everything was web or .com. Now everything's AI. And a lot of startups may or may not actually be developing artificial intelligence, but I think that as a society, and especially in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of thought of artificial intelligence taking away jobs from people. And I am not the expert on the economic part of that, but I would say that AI and AI technology has potential for actually liberating people and freeing them from a lot of menial tasks that they have to do day to day. And I think of that as an opportunity. Obviously, there's always threats or risks when things change, but all these trends to me point to a very bright future.
Great, wonderful. So John, you work all around the world with companies and help them see what they're missing. Is that it in a nutshell?
That's a fair statement.
So given the research that you do and the companies that you work with, what do you see as some of the key trends that are going to shape the future of the economy?
Yeah, our view is that we are in the early stages of what we would describe as a big shift that is really going to transform our economy, society, political arrangements. It takes many different forms, and I think the paradox, if you will, is that it at one level is going to create expanding opportunity that would have been unbelievable 20, 30 years ago, but it's also going to create increasing pressure on all of us for performance and increasing performance over time. So one of the trends that we would highlight is a combined trend towards increasing fragmentation and increasing concentration in the economy. And again, shaped in large part by technology, the means of production are becoming accessible to more and more people. It used to be that if you wanted to make a product, you had to have a large factory and scale operations to make it a viable proposition. Increasingly, with technologies like 3D printing, it is possible to do this in your garage. We're already seeing that happen in things like video and music. And so a lot of fragmentation in the product space. Increasingly specialized creative products targeted to more specific individual needs of customers. On the other side, the concentration side, infrastructure management businesses, high volume routine processing activities, running a logistics network, running data center operations, those we believe are going to concentrate on a global scale. And we also see an opportunity for concentration around something that we call the trusted advisor business. Businesses that will become more helpful to us in sorting through all the increasing choice that's available to us and the rapid evolution of that choice. We need somebody who knows us, that we can trust to help us navigate through all that. We think that has very powerful concentration opportunities as well. So the paradox is these two things happening in parallel, but creating expanding opportunity in the product space for those who previously would have been not even conceivable as a small business can now go into business and create a reasonably profitable business. Second trend, just at a very high level, is rethinking the rationale for why we have large institutions. I would say as a high-level generalization, for the past century at least, the institutions that we've had were driven by scalable efficiency. It was a notion that the reason we come together in large institutions is because it's lower cost to coordinate activity within a large institution than across many small institutions. And as a result, we've tightly specified all the activities, we've highly standardized all the activities, we've tightly integrated all the activities in the name of scalable efficiency. Our belief, again, is shaped in part by the evolution of technology, digital technology, is the rationale that will drive successful large institutions in the future is not scalable efficiency. It's scalable learning. That the reason we will come together in large institutions is because we'll learn faster as part of a large institution. And in a more rapidly changing world, scalable learning becomes essential to continuing success. So that's a second transition, second big shift. And then finally, a third big shift is a notion around the future of work. Alex touched on it a bit. We've actually published a paper on how robots are going to restore our humanity. Because if you think about the way we've defined work in a scalable efficiency world, tightly specified, highly standardized, tightly integrated, guess what? Robots can do that work much more efficiently than human beings can. And so it's just a matter of time before all those jobs get taken away. And thank God they're going to be taken away, because it becomes a catalyst to force us to rethink what could work be, what should work be for us as human beings. And focus on redefining work around things like curiosity, creativity, imagination, emotional intelligence, social intelligence. Finally, we'll be able to do work that's worthy of us as human beings and enable us to achieve much more of our potential. I think the big issue with all these big shifts is they're going to be hugely challenging for the existing incumbents that we have. And by the way, when I say institutions, I'm not just talking about companies, I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about government agencies, I'm talking about all institutions are going to have to go through this shift. The challenge for the incumbents is that is a very difficult transition, and there's going to be a very high temptation, we believe, for the incumbents to resort to regulation, to build walls, to protect themselves from this big shift. And we're already seeing that play out in certain domains. We think there's a risk that it will expand in many other domains. And even if the incumbents don't use regulation as a way to hold off the new world out there, then you have the issue that regulations that we all live with today were developed for a very different world. And they are not going to evolve as rapidly as the world is evolving. So we're going to be continually struggling to harness this opportunity in the face of regulations that were designed for a previous world. So maybe I've talked too much there, but
not at all.
Thank you.
And you didn't give us anything to think about. I want to follow up on a couple of things you raised. Bob, you were talking about in your illustration of government intervention leading to more intervention, to more intervention, to more intervention around the healthcare. And you alluded to the fact that there's been a lot of intervention over 50, 60 years, and now it seems to be speeding up. Could you elaborate on that? And then importantly, could you talk about, we've spent 50 or 60 years getting here. How do we unwind it?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, just some of the milestones in that process. During World War II, there were wage and price controls. And so it was illegal for, one firm wants to bid away talented workers from another. They couldn't offer them a higher salary, but if they offered them to pay health insurance premiums, that didn't count as part of the package, the compensation package that was allowed. So that was one of the big reasons that it came to be that you get your health insurance from your employer. And then the tax code also solidifies that, as I'm sure many of you know, that right now if the employer pays for your health insurance, that's a deductible expense, but the employee doesn't have to count that as a taxable benefit. So again, especially for high income people, it makes a lot of sense to be getting your health insurance paid via your employer. But that also then leads to this crazy situation where you lose your job temporarily and you lose your health insurance. Right? Nobody says, hey, you want to go down, catch a game next week, go down to the state? oh no, I can't drive because I lost my job. I don't have car insurance right now. But if I get rehired, then I can drive again. No one talks like that because your auto insurance isn't tied to your employer, but yet people do say, oh yeah, I can't get that elective procedure right now. I got to wait till I get another job. And so that's one huge element of all this, and you see the various interventions that sort of solidify that. As far as the unraveling it, again, this problem, there's a certain logic inside of the Affordable Care Act, what people call Obamacare. Just really briefly, let me make sure you see it, and it's why President Trump's campaign promises to keep the good parts but get rid of the bad parts. That doesn't really work, as we've seen. And because what people liked is, oh, let's have universal coverage, right? Make it illegal for insurance companies to say, no, we're not giving you a policy because you've got cancer or something. They didn't want that. But if all they had done was pass legislation saying health insurance companies can't turn anybody away even for a pre-existing condition, the insurance companies could have complied with that, but it would have been a farce. They would have said, okay, yep, you're applying for health insurance, you have cancer, that's fine. Here's a policy, we're giving you a policy, and we're going to cap reimbursement at $10,000 and the premium's $10,000. There you go, right? You see how that wouldn't have worked? So that's why it had to have things like community rating, where, okay, you can't charge different premiums to people based on their condition, only upon broad demographic characteristics. You had to have essential health benefits. You couldn't just say, okay, here's a policy, and we'll cover things like routine checkups or whatever, but anything about your heart we're not covering. You couldn't issue policies like that, because again, that would be a farce that would deny what the whole point was, that really sick people needed to get health care and wanted to be able to pay for it through their insurance policies, right? So if you did all those things and that's where you let it sit, it wouldn't have worked, because then sick people would have signed up, healthy people wouldn't have, and the whole system would have collapsed. So that's why you needed the individual mandate to force everybody into the pool. Okay, so all these elements of the Affordable Care Act, there was a certain logic to it, and you couldn't just pick and choose and try to unravel it. So just really briefly, I think, and you see this already, sure, the long run solution would be to roll back the stuff at the federal level and all these interventions and restore freedom to the health insurance sector. There's a lot of regulations prohibiting who can go into medicine and so on. And so that's one way to bring those costs down, is to get rid of these arbitrary limits. But beyond that, in the short term, what do? Well, there's lots of practices popping up all over the country where medical professionals just take cash, right? And then that's one way to deal with it, because a part of the problem is you go to the hospital and you actually look at the bill and it's crazy. And there have been examples where, for example, in Nashville when I was there was a woman who was a radio correspondent, and she was pregnant, and she just wanted to see how much is it going to cost. And she called around to 10 local hospitals just saying, yeah, if I have a normal delivery and so on, there's no complication, how much is that going to cost? Only 1 out of the 10 was even willing to give her a quote, and even they said, that's not, you can't hold us to this, it's just a ballpark. And so you see how it's not a normal market where you don't even know what the price is going into it. They tell you after the fact how much it costs. So it shouldn't shock us that it seems like the market's not working here, because it's not a normal market. So part of how I think we unravel this is people, one practitioner at a time and consumers at a time, go over to doctors and dentists and so on that just do cash practice, or maybe they have some sort of catastrophic thing built in. But I think that's part of how we succeed, one person or one practice at a time.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of interesting things like heal.com and apps that call a doctor for a house call for $99. So there's a lot of interesting experimentation. Bill, we were talking a little bit earlier about this move to, there's a lot of talk in California about succession and Texas succession, and of course we have Brexit and so on. How does this whole process of succession work? Obviously, theoretically in the Constitution and well, the Articles, they wouldn't have needed to succeed because they didn't give up a lot of power. They didn't give up any power, so they didn't have to succeed. They retained their sovereignty. But under the Constitution, although it was a confederation, they were supposed to be able to secede. How do you see that in our modern day, or how does that concept help us towards freedom or choice today?
Well, the idea of secession is really, power can only be checked by power. It's an idea that one level of government can check the center by at least the threat to withdraw from an unprofitable federation or union. I think in the long run, for example, we'll see improvement, at least somewhat, in the European Union by the fact that the British exercised their right to leave a federation. They seceded. They call it Brexit, but it was a good old-fashioned secession. I think that's good for them. It's also good, I think, for other members of the EU insofar as those grievances that were voiced by the British could perhaps be addressed in the Union to prevent others from doing so. Secession, of course, is an American constitutional principle. We call it the American Revolution, but it was an American secession. You think about it, a revolution is where you wish to overthrow a government and put your own people in power. The colonists did not want to take over the British Parliament or remove George III from the throne. They wanted to remove themselves from that jurisdiction. That is a secession. Obviously, the U.S. Constitution, if you look at it in its purest form, clearly supports such a premise. Many of the states that ratified the Constitution in their ratification messages made it very clear that if the Union did not turn out to be all that was promised, they could withdraw, resume certain powers there. The mechanism for doing that in the American historical practice would be a convention. That is how a state constitution is created. The constituent power that rests only in the people is yielded to a convention of the people of each state, and through exercising this constituent power in a convention, they can join a union, they can withdraw from a union. Now, of course, many people think, well, that's just crazy talk. Didn't we have a late unpleasantness in the 1860s? And how could California or some state contemplate that today? Well, I mentioned earlier as we were talking about this, I was a young soldier in Germany, in West Germany at the time, stationed there in the late 80s. And if you would have told me at the time that Soviet states would be seceding from the Soviet Union and tanks weren't going to roll in and crush these people, I'd have told you you're crazy. But just a few short years later, we have an exodus from the Soviet Union, destruction of that country, and independent states forming. Could it happen here? Absolutely.
Right. Okay, we're going to open it up to you now.
Got a comment for Mr. Lloyd. He had mentioned that there was a thought of some people renting their closet space, and what I had heard on different blogs and such, that there are some young people that are actually living out of their cars, and they were contracting with homeowners to rent the driveway. So this way they could actually have a legal presence there on the premises. So, Mr. Lloyd, have you heard anything about that? And I thought that was encouraging when you mentioned that about renting out a closet.
I don't really know if that's a viable business, but what I think either one of those, but what I do think it points to kind of the system technology routing its way around regulation. I think these are all signs of overregulation in the housing market, rental market, and I mean, there's no reason why there couldn't be enough housing so that people could afford housing in San Francisco, but for misguided, I think mostly government regulation that prevents people from building so the supply can meet demand. All these technologies, which I think is a really interesting point, is if I remember your comment about there being no wars between countries where they're both democracy and both have free exchange of free trade. I think technology is the next cementing glue. If you think of the examples that I used, from blockchain of changing of values to the sharing economy, that actually also cements relations between countries. And we'll see that if that's true. But technology is letting help. I think often repairing problems that have been generated by other parts of the economy, mostly people who have a gut instinct to centrally plan things. And I hope that the entrepreneur who's helping people rent their driveways out is successful, but it's probably not an investment for me.
Sure is asking for it. Yeah, first the government makes affordable housing illegal, and then it decides it's going to build it, but it doesn't do so.
Right.
Yeah.
Morning. I have a question for all five of you, if you'd like to answer, but certainly it's about Bitcoin. There are two parts of my brain concerning Bitcoin. One is the computer science programming part, and the other is the pragmatic government understanding part. The question is this. Bitcoin, I like the underlying concept of Bitcoin, the blockchain. And of course, lots of organizations are beginning to look at that right now because they assume that before the quantum computing techniques are extended to destroy the security of Bitcoin, it'll last for a number of years, maybe decades. The challenge, however, is the political one, and I'm very worried about that. There are a number of countries, as we know, China specifically, but there are many others, which regulate Bitcoin intensely. This government has, in the past few years, modified the analysis from a tax standpoint of how Bitcoin is created. If Bitcoin becomes a serious challenge to a government-controlled monetary system, for example, the Federal Reserve Board here considers it to be a challenge, what would prevent the country, the government, from outlawing Bitcoin or regulating it in such a way that it won't be successful? And last comment about that is, when you take Bitcoin today, to make it work for something else, you ultimately have to take it back into dollars. Well, it is true that there are some organizations that will swap Bitcoins for Bitcoins, but they're still denominated in dollars and the transactions are taxed in dollars. So the question then is, why should Bitcoin survive if it becomes a real challenge to the government monopoly protected money?
Who wants to start?
I guess I'll start. I think that you need to differentiate between Bitcoin, which is just one currency. Maybe Bitcoin becomes a successful cryptocurrency where people are using it day to day, but maybe it doesn't. And honestly, that's not really important to the success of that type of technology. I think my view is that maybe Bitcoin was created in order to create this cryptographical blockchain technology is a huge investment in computing power. And it seems to me that Bitcoin, even if it fails as to replace the dollar, it has been successful in letting people be incentivized to build that network. So that's just one side. So you could have, IBM is launching blockchain technology that they're developing in-house, or they're using actually open source. So that technology can succeed now that it's been proven with or without Bitcoin being successful. The other side of that is, yeah, you're right, the government can block Bitcoin or disincentivize Bitcoin or make it hard for it to be successful. But I think as is in the free market, there is a free market of countries. And imagine a country that's wealthy like Singapore or some other advanced country that maybe is not the United States, could be Hong Kong before it had been taken back by the Chinese, or maybe Switzerland, becoming a Bitcoin or a blockchain friendly country, and all the advantages that would give that country. There would be much less chance that there would be inflation. There's an actual mathematical formula for figuring out the value. All the exchanges, banks are less necessarily, and the friction is reduced. When such a country, if that happens, all other countries will have to compete in a financial world against that country, and capital tends to flock to countries that are more friendly to exchange of capital. So maybe that will never happen, but I think that's a way that in the end, everybody is going to have to somewhat be friendly to blockchain technology, because you don't really want to be a third world country when it comes to your finances, or backward looking country.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that, it's sort of the premise of your question is sort of like, if it becomes a threat, couldn't they stop it, and why would people want to hold it? Well, presumably lots of people would be holding it and using it if that's why it would be a threat in the first place, right? So, yeah, there's all kinds of stuff they could do. I mean, people used gold, and arguably what they did in the 1930s kind of really stamped that out with long prison sentences and so on to force people to stop using gold the way they had been doing. But it's I would say that's kind of the benefit of Bitcoin. So yeah, we can't predict the future, and who knows how forceful the regime will be, but it's going to be hard. The average person, if they're using Bitcoin, it's going to be hard to prove that, right? So it's because you don't have anything physical on you. All you do is memorize something, and you have no physical evidence, right? So I think it'd be hard to stamp it out if it's a community that's using it because their currency's collapsing anyway, and that's why they're all using it. The government tries to crack down.
Just a quick comment. I mean, a lot of the discussion was on Bitcoin, but to the point earlier, there's an underlying technology, blockchain, that actually has much broader potential application rather than just currency. And it's this whole notion of creating a distributed, trusted ledger for transactions. And that has enormous potential to really disrupt a lot of businesses that today are that trusted intermediary that will certify the transaction, versus now a platform that's distributed that will certify the transaction. And one of the key values we believe in blockchain is that it makes those transactions much more visible to a broader range of participants so they can learn faster about the transactions that are going on rather than having all that information tightly held by a central intermediary that's going to hold that information for their own benefit. So a lot of potential for change as a result of blockchain.
Yeah, this will be
Lady
two
here.
questions. One for Robert. This is under the category of the deficit without tears. How long do you think this interest rate anomaly is going to be able to be sustained? And what under the category of big shift, what is going to happen if they actually have to or compelled to normalize interest rates? And for John, concerning your assertion about the largeness of institutions, how is this going to avoid the pitfalls of bureaucracy, particularly since we're in the light of Mises' pamphlet on bureaucracy and the negative consequences of that phenomena?
Okay, so yeah, as far as your first question, when are interest rates going to rise in the future? So
Write that
it's
down.
yeah. But in all seriousness, I think you're right, and that's something I've been telling people. It's obviously Congress was involved or whatever, but during the Obama administration, there were 4 years in a row where they ran a deficit of over $1 trillion. Right, 4 years in a row that happened. I mean, that's larger than most economies, and that's how much the government was spending more than it took in revenues those years. And so, but I don't think we sense the pain of that because that was right when interest rates were collapsing to basically zero for Treasury yields. And so just like you can run up huge credit card bills as long as you keep getting those 0% APR offers and keep rolling over. But then when those stop and you go back to normal interest rates, it's devastating. Same thing here. I think he was mentioning that the public debt right now is about $20 trillion. So if Treasury yields went up to just 5%, which historically is not high, that's $1 trillion a year just in servicing the debt, even if they ran a balanced budget from now on, which they won't. And so that just gives you a sense of the hole into which they've dug themselves. And so I think you're exactly right that that's going to be painful. The last thing I'll say on that is as they're raising interest rates, and the Fed under Yellen has actually been trying to do that, right? So I think some people who are libertarian or whatever, they sort of lump in Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen together, all a bunch of crazy inflationists. And no, it's Yellen's actually, her role has been to oversee a tightening. That's why the dollar's been strengthening. They're trying to raise rates, but they're going to be stuck in the situation like where as they're raising it, the way they're doing it is by paying commercial banks more and more to not make loans to people, right? They call it's interest on reserves for commercial banks to keep their money parked with the Fed instead of advancing loans to kind of bottle up all that money they pumped into the financial sector. So again, that gets more expensive in the sense of the Fed has less money now to give to the Treasury because it's paying banks more and more as the interest rate rises. So there's a two-pronged thing where the Treasury and the Fed are going to get squeezed as they're raising interest rates, but they have to do that as price inflation starts rising. So I think they had this unusual honeymoon period where they pumped in a bunch of money, ran huge deficits, and it seemed like nothing bad happened. And some of the critics, myself included, who were worrying about this is going to blow up, and it's so far it hasn't been the disaster some of us were worried about. And people say, you guys don't know what you're talking about, but that problem's still festering there, and it hasn't gone away.
And to the question about large institutions and becoming bureaucracies, I think that's the essence of this big shift from scalable efficiency to scalable learning. Large institutions in a scalable efficiency world become bureaucracies. The most successful institutions are bureaucratic institutions that, again, tightly specify everything that needs to be done, highly standardize it, and your job as a human being is to fit into that institution and do what you're told and fit into the role that's been assigned to you. It's all about the human fitting into the institution. And by the way, again, I'm talking about all institutions here. In a scalable learning world, which is the institutions that we believe will become large and successful in the future, fundamentally shift to where the institution, the organization, has to organize around the individuals, because it's the individuals who are going to drive the learning. And by the way, when I talk about learning in this context, I'm not talking about sharing existing knowledge. That's an interesting form of learning, but the most effective and powerful form of learning in a rapidly changing world is creating new knowledge together. And that requires a fundamentally different environment that is totally antithetical to bureaucratic culture and system. And so one of the things when I deal with executives and I talk about scalable efficiency, scalable learning, they say, wow, that's really interesting. We'll do both. No. Our view is a choice is required. And when you make that choice, understand it changes everything in the institution. Everything needs to be rethought. And ultimately, we believe that will ensure that they don't become bureaucratic, that they actually accelerate learning the bigger they get.
As these jobs are eliminated by artificial intelligence, there are lots of people in the world who aren't creative and varying capacities for learning. What's going to happen to all of these people who are displaced by technology?
If I could take that one, I'll try not to go into too much of a tirade here. Actually, I get this point a lot. Not all of us can be creative and imaginative. What's going to happen to the vast majority of people? My answer to that is, let's go to a playground and let's go look at children 5 or 6 years old. Point one out to me that's not creative and imaginative. Something happened to them between 5 and 6 years old and today. What happened? Our school systems, which were explicitly designed to train us to become robots in large institutions. Follow orders reliably and predictably. And I believe that we're going to have to transform our educational institutions as part of this big shift, and that ultimately all of us have the potential to be creative and imaginative.
And along those lines, I think, if you think, like, one of the big disruptions that have happened in the tech world and the music world is, well, music used to be a product. And people used to sell music, and there was always this fear like, oh, if you can't sell music, musicians are going to go away, because how are they going to make money? And what has actually happened is that the human element of being a musician, which is performing, is actually, and other revenues, but not necessarily selling the music part has been what's taken over. And I can't predict exactly what the same analogy is, but there'll be different models that enable creativity and let people, maybe it's, I think there'll be a value for stuff that's created by someone's hand versus by a machine. Maybe you can price differentiate there. Maybe it's being more creative. I go to Burning Man a lot, and I see what humans that don't even consider themselves artists are able to do for a crazy week in the desert. It's a complete unleashing of creativity. There's a lot of ways where people don't think they're creative, but in the end, they can use their hands and their minds to do creative things. And I think that if you have some sense that the free market will work, that there might be dislocation, and there might be pain, but in the end, humanity will be much richer.
If I could just briefly jump in on that. The people I follow, a lot of them economists, and there's two schools of thought on AI. So the one hand, they say, it's going to ruin our job prospects. The robots are going to do everything. We're all going to be unemployed. On the other hand, they're worried that these super AI is going to take over and enslave us all. And my modest point is those both can't be true at the same time, right? If they enslave us all, we'll all have jobs, right? So that's all I'm saying. So you don't need to worry about that. But more seriously, I would just, we don't know the future, but again, these types of worries happen, right? When agriculture, when productivity went up there and it got more automated, and so one farmer with tractors and fertilizer and irrigation techniques could do what 10 small farmers used to do more, with their own hands and animals before, people were worried, what are all these people going to do? But now we realize, well, a few people making all the food, that frees us up to do other stuff. Okay, so these dislocations happen, and it's not pleasant for the people who are directly involved, but in terms of the span of human history, we can see that's how things progress.
And I would just add on a personal note, I worked in a secretarial pool. I typed the same letter over and over again, or a spreadsheet over and over again. It wasn't fun, and it was a job, but there were a whole lot of us in that secretarial pool. And that you don't have those anymore, and we're all doing more interesting things or different things that we wouldn't have known existed if we'd stayed in the pool, so to speak. So the last thing you want is having the government coming in and creating a safety net that keeps us where we are, instead of being able to look around at the possibilities and other people being able to start enterprises that can, maybe I'm not the creative person, but John is, and he starts an enterprise, and I go, hey, that looks neat, can I do that with you, kind of thing. And the last thing you want is the government coming in and keeping me from looking and finding out that John's doing this really cool thing that I want to be a part of. So I'm very optimistic about this, as long, again, we don't let them try to freeze us where we are.
My favorite proposal in that regard is, let's tax the robots. Hey, absolutely. It's not just the incumbents in terms of large companies that are going to resist these changes. It's the workforce as well. And increasingly, we do need to find ways to make the transition so that we can all go into this new world. But again, key theme for our work is it's going to create expanding opportunity for all of us. That's the exciting part.
Absolutely, it's liberating.
On this topic you're speaking about, I somewhat agree with you about the scalable learning elements. You suggest that most people have curiosity and creativity and all that sort of thing to a degree, but I look around and I see enough people who can't even fill out a Form 1040-EZ on their own. It makes me question how much depth in a population of 340 million people we have with this kind of creativity that will allow them to succeed in this situation. Now, as a result of that, there have been proposed, and in fact, I think in Switzerland, they recently voted on whether or not they would do this, is having a guaranteed minimum income, that regardless of whether you work or not, that would be available. What do you think of that idea as a complement to this? Because there are going to be, as you indicated, a great deal of resistance, walls built around the existing structure to prevent people from becoming destitute in this process. So one of the ideas to avoid that is this guaranteed minimum income.
Okay, yeah, I'll say a few remarks on that. So I think for technical reasons, I'm against those particular proposals. I think the math doesn't work out. That the idea is the government gives everybody a certain floor, and then they try to phase that out. So if you earn above that, there's not disincentives. But in order for them to raise the money to be able to give everybody that floor, the average tax rate on the part that is being taxed has to be a lot higher. So I'm worried that just in terms of incentives, that will screw things up. But more philosophically, I don't like the idea of everyone now getting a check from the government, and then that's how you get supported. But with all this stuff, I hope we're not coming off as, just do it yourself, and my gosh, if you don't have it, then your character's bad and sorry. That's not what we're saying. There's lots of local solutions, private charities, things like that, where people do need to help each other. And one of the tragedies is when that gets co-opted by the political process, now people don't want to donate to the local food bank or whatever because they say, yeah, I pay taxes for that. And so to the extent that the bureaucratic distribution of those proceeds is not nearly as efficient or as compassionate or as targeted to the truly deserving and needy, then the whole thing breaks down. So I do think that there's a large role in the Independent Institute's got, I don't know if Mary wants to name some things, but certainly publications, I think the Voluntary City is one of them, where talking about how it's not that we're all for-profit corporations and that's it, and everything's got to be through dollars and cents. There's plenty of voluntary institutions, philanthropic, to help each other, and it doesn't need to be through the political process, though.
I think Thomas Sowell wrote a great article about a month ago on this, and I think that, you should read it because it's much better than how I can explain it, but he says by doing that, you're basically robbing people of happiness. And if you think about a fulfilling life, being creative is one part, but also just succeeding at something and making something, and by enabling people to do that, you're actually hurting them. So read his essay.
We also did a symposium in a recent issue of the Independent Review, and I think it's all online now, on the basic income guarantee. And there are different takes on it, but goes through it very carefully. And I agree. I grew up part of the time on a ranch in Nevada, and all you have to do is go visit the Indian reservations and see it saps people's soul to just get a check for doing nothing. It robs you of the opportunity of discovering who you are and what you can do. So I think it's a really horrible idea, and I think we can develop institutions within our communities, which we're talking about, and some of these other things talk about, that can help that transition and make that transition much more harmonious and peaceful, and have a much happier ending than if we let the government be our nanny, essentially. Last question? I can't believe it. Okay, one last question. Who has it?
Okay, my question is a completely different area. I think one of the most important issues facing the United States and the world today is the spread of war in the U.S. warfare state. As you probably know, yesterday Trump bombed Syria Air Force Base, in which there are Iraqi troops, Iranian troops, sarin gas, and possibly Russian troops also. And the U.S., of course, is the largest seller of arms in the entire world. And the peace movements in the U.S. pretty much seemed to have collapsed once Obama took office, because Obama, of course, was for peace. Turns out that the number of countries with U.S. troops have increased by almost 40% since Obama took office.
Your question, please?
The question, quite simply, is this. What can the libertarian movement do to build a viable peace movement in the United States?
Okay, well, we're not a libertarian movement, but we're an institution of discovering different things. But this is an area Independent has worked in very heavily, especially in the 21st century. And it gets back to especially peaceful coexistence between countries through free trade and free flow of information among us, and not turning over these decisions to our centralized powers and so on.
No,
Bill, maybe you want to weigh in on this.
I think one thing that we need to figure in the equation is, again, the Constitution was sold to us as the president has limited powers. Congress, the representatives of the people, will have the decision to declare war, to use troops. Every 2 years, Congress has to approve a budget, therefore troops could not be used large scale. Again, that's a falsehood that was told to us as we see the executive deciding when to use troops, when to engage in war, and our legislative branch has abdicated its responsibility to the people, to the mothers and fathers of the troops in harm's way, to make those decisions, to play a role. I think removing this monarchical power from the executive would go a long way to bringing back peace.
So thank you very much.